Thanks, John. That's good stuff. I was sitting in front of those young men back there singing tenor. Our tenor section for a few years was about 4 of us. It is no longer that way. It's really nice to sit there. I told those guys, I'm just going to sit there and listen to them. They're doing a lot better than I will anyway. I just listen to them. Who here is a history of flight buff? Know a lot about history, flight, airplanes, George, Wilbur, Kitty Hawk, that kind of stuff? And just history buffs in general. You'll know who I'm talking about. If you're any sort of follower of the history of flight, or like I said, probably just history in general, you will certainly know the name Clarence D. Chamberlain. As you know, June 4th, 1927, Clarence Chamberlain piloted his custom-built single-engine monoplane, you know the name, Columbia, from Roosevelt Field in New York across the Atlantic, landed in Eiselbein, Germany on June 6th, 2 days. Took him 3,911 miles, took about 43 hours. Or you're thinking, I have never heard of this guy. And that's probably the case, and that's probably because on May 21st, 1927, less than 3 weeks before Clarence D. Chamberlain, Charles A. Lindbergh completed the very first solo flight across the Atlantic, flying the Spirit of St. Louis, that you probably heard of, from New York to Paris, which even makes it even cooler because he flew to Paris. Now, it wasn't that Chamberlain's feat was not impressive or that it wasn't remarkable or that it wasn't outstanding. It just wasn't first. He was just the second one to do it. It reminds me of a particular teaching of Jesus and a teaching of Paul's. Now listen, not comparing them, but this is just a particular use of a specific phrase. Paul would be the first to say, this is no competition. There is no competition with Jesus' teaching. But Paul would be the first to say, I'm not trying to compare teaching, and that's not what I'm trying to do. It is interesting, however, to compare their use of this phrase and how we have perceived the use of this phrase. In John's gospel, Jesus uses a powerful phrase. A very powerful phrase, at least 7 times, to paint a better picture, a fuller picture of who he is, to help us understand who Jesus is. Now, these statements of Jesus have been written about in books. There have been lectureships and conferences studying just these specific statements. In fact, Richard just finished a series on Jesus's great I am statements. Powerful, powerful statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the true vine. Amazing, amazing statements with profound theological, spiritual implications, making that connection all the way back to Exodus chapter 3, where God spoke, maybe the pre-incarnate Christ, work on that one for yourself. That's amazing to study. But said from that burning bush to Moses that tell them, I am sent you. And Jesus then says, I am, over and over and over. Powerful, powerful statements. And then, 25, 30 years later, Paul writes a letter to the church in Rome, which is a powerful letter, profound theological treatise that Paul writes to this church in Rome. And he makes some profound statements using the same phrase. Just not first. Jesus used it first. And certainly not with the theological weight of Jesus' statement. But tonight I want us to briefly look at these other I am statements in Romans chapter 1. Those of the Apostle Paul's, as he writes to the church in Rome to tell them a little something about himself, to provide us a little fuller picture of who Paul is, but then to also provide us with maybe some motivation, maybe some understanding of what our role, what our expectations for ourselves should be. Paul begins the letter to the church in Rome, of course, like he always does, with an introduction. He tells them a little bit about himself. He tells them about his desire to be there in Rome with them, that he'd love to be there and bear some spiritual fruit with them in verse 13. Then in verse 14, here's the first of Paul's I am statements. He says, I am obligated both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. Paul says, I am, your translation may say, I am a debtor, or I am indebted. Paul considered himself held by obligation to these people. He considered himself to be bound to do something for these people. He was, and why is that? Because he says, I was sent for a purpose. He said, I want to be there with you. I want to come there. I want to bear some spiritual fruit with you all. So why is he a debtor? Why is he obliged? This doesn't mean that to Paul this is a have-to thing. He doesn't mean, well, I'm just obligated to do this, so I have to. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is he feels a moral responsibility to these people. He feels like there is something that he is owed, that he owes these people. Now, let's be clear, Paul doesn't owe anybody anything. He doesn't owe this church in Rome any time, any teaching, or anything. That's not what he's saying. There's nothing that any man had done for Paul that put this burden on his heart, that made him feel like he was obliged to them, that he was obligated to them. It was what Christ did for him. It was what Jesus had done for him that made him feel that he was a debtor to all people of all races, of all nations, to the Romans obviously included. He says both to the Greeks and the barbarians, to the wise and the foolish. He's not being insulting. It's just how they referred to each other. The Jews referred to everybody as Jews and Gentiles, the rest of us, yeah. Romans referred to everybody as either Romans or pagans. The Greeks referred to everybody as Greeks or barbarians, and that's why he refers to this in Rome, because Rome is really, at this point in history, kind of just an extension of Greek culture, but that's a different topic altogether. But what's he saying when he says this? C.S. Lewis, a great quote from C.S. Lewis, he says, none of you have ever met any ordinary people because there are not ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. You ever thought about that? Everybody you meet is immortal. It's kind of weird, huh, to think about. What does that mean? It means they're all going to live forever. That's why Paul says that he's indebted to these people, because what Paul sees are souls. He doesn't care what your race is. He doesn't care where you're from. He doesn't care if you're Jew or Greek or barbarian or foolish or wise or smart or educated. He says, I'm obliged to go teach people because of what Jesus has done for me. The question we have to ask is, has God done anything less for me than he did for Paul? And again, it's what Christ did for him that made him feel that he was obliged to these people, made him feel like he was a debtor. Christ died for Paul, called Paul to be an ambassador for him, saved his soul from sin, made him an heir of eternal life, gave him a guarantee of salvation. Hasn't Jesus done that for each of us? Paul says, I am obliged, I am obligated to go teach these people. Each of us should feel the same level of debt. Each of us should feel the same level of obligation. Why is that? Because the world in which we live, which includes our families, which includes our close friends, which includes the people we're around every day, these are people to whom we should feel indebted because they need to know who Jesus is. They need to know what Jesus has done for them. They need to know that no matter who they are, where they come from, what their background is, that Jesus wants to offer them salvation. And they need to know that without Jesus, they're lost. To whom do you owe the debt of telling them about Jesus? The second statement, he just keeps going here. He says, I am obliged. Verse 15, he says, so I am eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. He says he's excited about this. He says, I am eager, I'm ready, your translation might say, to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. Now listen, Paul, this is actually another repeat. Because all this, he's just repeating the Great Commission in different words. He's just saying, I'm ready to go into all the world and preach the gospel. He's saying that he realizes something. Now, Paul's a preacher, we get that. But what he's saying is what we need to realize is that this message, that Great Commission, his readiness to preach the gospel applies to all of us. It's not just to people who stand up there. It's not just to guys like me and Richard and Jared and other preachers. It's to all of us. This idea of the readiness to preach the gospel. That's what Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, where he says what? He tells you to be ready, to be prepared, to do what? To give an answer for the hope. That's what we just sang about, isn't it? To be ready to give an answer for that hope that we just sang about. Be prepared to do that. Be ready to share the living hope with the world around us. Our world needs hope. Our world needs us to be ready to share it with them. Now listen, Paul says, again here, he says, what's he ready to preach? He's ready to preach the gospel. Now Paul has defined that in a couple of places. Paul knows what he's talking about. What Paul is not talking about, he told the Galatians in the first chapter, he said, I'm not talking about some make up your own gospel, some other gospel. That's what he tells them. So what Paul's telling us is what he wants to preach is Christ and him crucified. Not a make yourself feel good gospel. Not a make it fit whatever your life is like gospel. Because that's, as he would tell the church in Galatia, that's not a real gospel. That's not going to help anybody. Going to teach people some gospel that is just something that fits their lives, not letting them fit into the gospel of Jesus Christ, that's not going to help them. So Paul says, I'm ready to preach the gospel like we talked about this morning. Just preach Jesus to people. Let people know who Jesus is. Tell people about the hope that's found in Jesus. But also notice Paul says, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. Who's he writing this letter to? Christians, right. Very good. He's writing this letter to the church in Rome. And he says, I want to preach the gospel to you. What does that mean? He's not trying to teach them how to be baptized for the forgiveness of their sins. He's talking to the church. He's telling them that we need to be encouraged. We need to be reminded. We need to be encouraged to be passionate for this. We need to be equipped. Because he's the one that writes himself that that's kind of his purpose. Is the purpose of leadership, the purpose of the gifts that are given to the church are to equip each other, to prepare us for the work that we have to do. We need to be encouraged and reminded to be passionate. The NFL season started today, or Thursday, I guess, but really kind of today. And if you follow, I don't follow NFL hardly at all, except for my incredibly terrible every single year fantasy football team. But I watch a lot of college football if I can. And if you try and watch it all, you've got to see commercials. So you're going to see NFL commercials. And they have these commercials every now and then that will show you fans. And fans can be the most annoying, rabid, bothersome people on earth. Oh, man, I really want to say something. I'm not going to. Some teams have worse fans than others. I'll just put it that way. And okay, I got to use it. I'll go to an NFL illustration. No offense, but if it's you, sorry. Raiders fans are the worst. I mean, it's unreal what those people do. In fact, we were watching the BSU game the other night. Have you ever seen the BSU Elvises? How do you feel dressed up like that when your team gets beat? I mean, that's why I'm not a face painter, because how embarrassing would that be? You see on TV and you just got creamed, and you're like, I mean, I don't get. But why do those people do that? Because they're passionate about a team they're not on, about a game they have zero control over, about people they do not even know personally. We ought to be the most passionate people on earth. We ought to be ready to preach the gospel. I don't mean up there preach. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean just tell people about Jesus. We ought to be ready to tell people. Verse 16, his final I am statement. And this is where he goes a little negative. He says, for I am not ashamed of that gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Again, here's the thing. First to the Jews and also to the Greek. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why not? He says it's God's power to save. And again, he's just saying to the Jew first, then to the Greek. That's not an insult. That's the way God did it. What does it mean to be ashamed? Definition of ashamed is a feeling of fear or embarrassment that keeps a person from doing something. I think that's the reason most of us aren't willing to share our faith, aren't comfortable sharing our faith. It's not that we're ashamed of Jesus. I don't believe that. I believe for the most part that is not our issue. I think what we're ashamed of is the potential of shame. And it's just called fear. Is what if I mess up? What if I don't say the right thing? Or what if this person gets mad at me? What if this person insults me? What if I sever this friendship because I'm trying to tell this person about Jesus? For I'm not ashamed. I'm willing to take a risk. I'm willing to say, I'm going, and if this person I'm talking to, if they understand how much I love them, it's not going to bother them when I tell them about Jesus. Because they're going to know me well enough to know that all I'm doing is showing them I care. Showing them I love them. Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 1:7 that we don't have anything to fear. We should not have. God didn't give us a spirit of fear or timidity, but instead a spirit of power. That's what he's talking about here, because that's what he says the gospel is. The gospel is God's power. That ought to be encouraging to us, because that ought to remind us that it isn't about me anyway. It's not about how eloquent I am or how well I present my message or how well I go through the OBS study or how well I click the Jewel Miller film strips thing or whatever. It's not me anyway. The power is in the gospel. The power is in the message about Jesus. The word he uses there for power, we had this as a lectureship 3 or 4 years ago or whenever it was. It's the word dunamis, which is literally the word we get dynamite from. That's the kind of power he's talking about. It is the power of God to salvation for everybody. So the power is not in us. The power is in the message, which is exactly what Jesus said in Romans 12, verse 23 or verse 32, where he said, if I am lifted up, what will he do? I'll draw all men to myself. We lift up Jesus, we're going to be drawing people to Jesus. That's the message for it. Just lift up Jesus. And then he goes on in verse 17 to talk about the justification that comes from that. The reason, he says, for in it, verse 17, he says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. The faith is where we start and faith is where we end up. Paul goes through the rest of this letter. If you've never read the letter to the church in Rome in one setting, do that sometime. Find an easy to read translation and just sit and read it like a letter. It's incredible. like Paul needs my congratulations. Nice work, Paul. You did all right there. But he didn't get the first famous I am statements. Paul's I ams may not be the first. They may not be as well known as Jesus' I am statements, but they're powerful. I am obliged to tell the world about Jesus. I'm ready. I'm ready to tell my extended family. I'm ready to tell my friend. I'm ready to remind my family about the hope that's contained in a relationship with Jesus. And I'm not ashamed. I'm proud of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I'm willing to take a risk to let somebody know how important Jesus is to them. Can I say that? Can I honestly make those statements? Those are questions we all have to ask. I'm obligated, I'm ready, and I'm not ashamed. I am. Well, I am offering you an invitation this evening. It's God's invitation. If you're a Christian and you're struggling with implementing any of these things into your life and you'd like help, you'd like us to sit down and pray together, we can certainly do that. If you're not a Christian and maybe you're ready to take those steps, maybe you just want to figure out more about what that's all about, If there's anything we can do, we're going to stand and sing in just a second. Come up and let's talk about that while John leads us in the song. Let's stand and sing.